Davidson. The Wednesday, April 12th Performance Committee will now come to order. We are convened as of 9:03 a.m. Mountain Daylight Time. I'd respectfully ask everyone attending to please mute your phone unless you are asked to speak or your computer audio. Thanks for joining us this morning. Please note that this committee meeting, like the others, are being held remotely via Zoom, and there'll be audio and video recorded. Those recordings can be accessed on the RTD Board of Directors website. And again, please, if everyone can mute, thank you. Directors and members of staff, for the sake of the record, if you'd like to be acknowledged during today's proceedings, I would ask you to please raise your virtual hand and wait for me to call upon you before proceeding to speak. Directors and staff participating by phone can raise their hands by doing so by pressing *9, and to toggle your mute settings, *6. I think at this point we all know the virtual drill. I'm going to go ahead and now call for the roll of the committee members. Director Busick.
Here.
Director Catlin.
Here.
Director Deschel. Director Geisinger. We saw Director Geisinger, I'll mark is here. Director Guzman. Director Sloan.
Here.
And Davidson, I am here. So we have 5 present, 2 currently absent. If the 2 join us later, I will note that for the record. We'll go into the public comment section. If there are any hands raised, I'll go ahead and call on those, as well as note whether any comments have been submitted in writing. May I go ahead and ask staff? I'm not seeing any hands. But do we have any comments that were submitted in writing?
No, there were no emails.
Great. Thank you very much. We will close out our public comment period. We're going to go to right to discussion items. There is one discussion item today. This is with regards to the 2023 General Manager and CEO Performance Review Planning. So I'll go ahead and queue up the discussion here and make a brief presentation. I think throughout the discussion here, we'll call on multiple directors. I think as a heads up, I'd also like to get some input throughout the discussion here from our General Manager and CEO, Ms. Johnson. And probably no surprise, Ms. Snyder, I may check in with you from time to time as we clarify some of those items in the contract that you and I did have a chance to discuss. So thank you, everybody. So as we will recall from the last Performance Committee meeting, what we discussed, I think it was unanimous among committee members that there was an opportunity and a need to improve our performance review process of both the agency and of the CEO and General Manager, Deborah Johnson. We talked a little bit about what some of the ideas were from current committee members, things individuals would like to see improve. There were a number of common threads throughout that discussion related to improving the quality and reliability of the subjective feedback that's given to Ms. Johnson, as well as revisiting some of the objective criteria we use to measure agency and CEO performance. At the end of that meeting, we discussed that all committee members prior to this meeting would review 3 things. We would review the strategic plan as adopted by the RTD Board of Directors, first adopted on August 10th, 2021. We agreed that we would review the General Manager and CEO employment agreement entered into first on September 29th, 2020, but most recently amended in its 4th amendment on October 26, 2022. And finally, that we would review the compensation study report that was completed by Gallagher Benefit Services Incorporated, which was dated November 18th, 2022. I would note that that study is actually referenced as something that will occur in the General Manager's agreement and is referred to as the compensation analysis. Then we said we'd get back together here and have a discussion about some of our key takeaways I know I have a number of them, and we'll lay out what we put in the discussion item today just to help guide this discussion, is that there's really three things I think we should walk away with from today. One, discuss among the committee members what our key takeaways were from reviewing the strategic plan, the general manager agreement, and the compensation analysis. Also, two, start discussing and identifying opportunities to improve the analysis of the agency and the performance of our general manager and CEO. And finally, I think the way to frame those first two bullets is really to leave here with some specific tasks and questions that we need to address to pursue performance analysis improvements, and that will actually help set our future meeting cadence, topics for our May and June meetings. So I have a number of things that I'm certainly willing to offer to the group in terms of takeaways, in terms of some next steps that we can discuss, but I'm going to go ahead and yield the floor for other committee members and start the discussion. So let's go ahead and focus first on what were some of those key takeaways, perhaps framing from, where there were potential gaps from, our actual performance, opportunities for improvement, and I'll start capturing how those might inform future tasks and future topics. So I'll go ahead and open the floor right now. Please go ahead and raise your hand if you would like to speak and highlight anything that you had learned or refreshed on from those three particular documents. Anybody have anything? Okay, well, I'll go ahead and throw a few things out there then. So here's some things that I saw in this. So first and foremost, we use in the strategic plan, we very clearly articulate our success outcomes, and we have numbers with our net promoter score improvements that we intend to make on those. And thus far, we've anchored our performance assessment of agency and general manager based on those success outcomes. Underneath those success outcomes, we quickly get to tactics that are used by staff that is used to drive the activities that ultimately fuel or feed into those success outcomes. And there are, throughout the strategic plan, a number of performance scorecards that are used on a quarterly basis and or on a functional basis for the various functions within the agency. Recognizing that those do change, one thing that occurred to me is we did hear a common theme last time we got together, that perhaps our success outcomes were not properly giving us the metrics that are accurately, identifying how well we think this agency is doing. To me, if there's a mismatch between, what board members think is going well for the agency or with our general manager, and we're not seeing that in the numbers, one of those is wrong. Our expectations are the numbers we're using. So one thing that had occurred to me was that when we look at objective ways to measure the agency, it would be useful to look a little bit deeper. I did notice also in the contract that we have not just the phrase weighted success outcomes, but there's actually the term goals in the existing contract with the general manager as to how we might evaluate her. So I was curious, and I will say I had a one-on-one discussion with the general manager about, how she is using goals with the team, how she's measuring her team. I thought having a discussion around that might be useful for informing future revisiting of our objective criteria. I'm actually not going to pause there because that's just one of my key takeaways, and I think that may even be in a meeting unto itself. Another takeaway that I had was that we very clearly have two concepts for evaluating the general manager and CEO. One is that objective that we suspected is not working well, and also one is the subjective. We might call this quantitative and qualitative analysis, but in the agreement, it is referred to as objective and subjective. It seems to me that we need to address both. So again, perhaps meeting topics all onto their own. I think we need to address both objective and subjective. I think another key takeaway that I particularly had was I don't think, and I'll admit my ignorance to this, I had fully appreciated that the Gallagher report was what the compensation analysis in the general manager's contract, and that our 2023 and go forward plan for her compensation increases, for her performance increases, both in base salary and incentive, would be tied to a compensation increase that we would determine based on the Gallagher report or the compensation analysis. So that is a very clear thing we need to do, is agree on what the compensation increase would be so that we can use the formula that's in Exhibit B to drive the performance improvement process and ultimately set the compensation increase for Ms. Johnson. Finally, I also really walked away with the idea that we need to have some collective collaboration with the general manager to ensure, going back to that subjective piece, that we design a process for performance improvement on those organizational values, which are more subjective or qualitative, to ensure that A, the board is giving feedback that we believe will help her performance improve or be adequately assessed, and likewise hear from the general manager what type of feedback she is seeking. So with all those takeaways, I arrived at the following next steps. I thought we needed to very clearly establish a compensation philosophy for our role of the CEO, forgetting about who our current CEO is. Clearly, we need to have a compensation philosophy. And I thank Ms. Pileggi and Ms. Snyder for their conversations with me about where some of the gaps are in our documents right now. I think if we set that compensation philosophy, we can then set the compensation increase that's referred to in the general manager's contract, make any adjustments to the overall compensation package. And then at that point, I think we need to establish an improved organizational values performance assessment process for 2023 that helps the CEO and general manager's feedback from us be more reliable, more actionable, and more direct in its delivery. And then finally, that we should be discussing improved methods for measuring objective performance of the agency for 2024. And reading these agreements, I thought a good timeline for that would be that by September 2023, this committee and the general manager have come up with an idea about how we might better measure objective metrics for agency performance, so that in October we can run this by the board, so that in November, General Manager Johnson can bring us her proposal that we are then supposed to ratify and bring to the board in December. So those were very high level. I know this is a lot of information that's not written down. These are examples of my takeaways. I'm happy to rewind back up through these and walk through them if members don't have others. But those are the types of things I started to take away. I'll go ahead and open the floor to any directors who, if that stimulated any thoughts you have. And first of all, I see Ms. Johnson, your hand is raised, so please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Director Davidson. For a point of clarification, I was somewhat confused by the timeline in which you outlined when you were talking about a proposal that would come forward in September that the board then can act on in December. And so was that more or less referring to the performance appraisal in and of itself?
No, sorry that I wasn't very clear in that. I'm trying not to take up too much time, and I probably skipped through some important pieces. So thanks for the clarification. Within the agreement, we have, and I'm just looking for the exact wording here. I believe I pulled it out. That beginning on November 1st, 2022, and each November 1st thereafter, for the remainder of the agreement, Ms. Johnson shall propose any suggested adjustments to the weighted success outcomes, organizational values, or goals, and the proposed distribution between base salary and incentive compensation, or the compensation increase of the board's consideration. So what my comments were, and my timeline may not be exactly right, dependent upon how we need to engage committee and board. But given that ultimately, I think based on our feedback from last committee, it sounds like we want to make improvements to all of those things. I think it would be a good idea for us. I don't see any reason for us to change or throw away or amend the construct of having that proposal from you in November, by November 1st, I should say. But since we're looking to potentially change this, I think it'd be good to dialogue and have some ideas of where we're going, so that if we're going to make any dramatic adjustments to, say, the success outcomes or objectives or goals that we're using to measure the agency, you have a good idea of what you might propose to us by November 1st, because there's not much time to get board approval in December to sign off on this. So I thought that if in September and October, we're framing up what would look good for 2024, you'd have adequate time to bring us a proposal in November 1st. And it wouldn't be the first time board members are seeing changes, so that the ratification or authorization would happen rather quickly and smoothly as it needs to get to December. Does that clarify my point a little bit?
If I may, Mr. Chair?
Please.
Yes, it does. So we're talking about going forward for 2024. I was taken aback because I made an assumption relative to 2023, recognizing the comments that you made prefacing the discussion. And so, okay, I'll yield the floor to directors, but I do have comments holistically in light of what you've stated and what we might do relative to overarching performance, because I do think it's a missed opportunity. And this was discussed previously, looking at the core functions that I should be adhering to relative to my responsibilities as GM and CEO. And those performance responsibilities can be tied into values with specific goals aligned to what this position is required to do for the betterment of the agency. So I'll just leave that there. Thank you.
Yeah, and thanks, Ms. Johnson. One clarification I'll bring before calling on Director Busick. I know I'm saying a lot here, but it really screamed to me that the contract says that we have the objective and the subjective piece. And I think the subjective piece is something we absolutely can and must correct for this year. So if we can get better organizational value and subjective feedback to the general manager this year, that should absolutely be doable within the construct of our existing contract. We don't have to change anything with the contract. That's a process change. That's this group. I think, again, that's probably its own meeting of discussing what's possible from a performance review standpoint on those subjective metrics. The November timeline I was referencing is more for the objective piece, which I don't think, looking at the contract, there's really much we can do for 2023. I think all improvements we'd be discussing would be on a 2024 basis, just in order to adhere to contract and what we already have in flight. Well, I also don't think it'd be fair to anyone to be trying to shift around metrics throughout the year here. We're already past a quarter in. So that was the other thing I wanted to clarify for everybody here is I think subjective we could tackle this year, objective, perhaps something we tackle for next year. Director Busick, you had your hand up. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I agree with to me, the objective portion of the evaluation takes care of itself once we set the appropriate metrics, right? Once we set what the compensation philosophy is, I really identify what strategic plan goals are.
Director Busick, sorry to interrupt. Would you mind, coming a little closer to the microphone or, yeah.
All right. I'll talk really loud. Okay.
Thanks.
Saying that the objective criteria, I believe, kind of take care of themselves once we establish the metrics. Hang on, I'm trying to adjust my microphone. Somebody else can start if they.
Those last words
Yeah,
were
thank you. Yeah, okay. It looks like Director Busick is adjusting microphone. Do other committee members have other thoughts while Director Busick gets adjusted there? Yeah, Director Geisinger.
I apologize. I was in transit and I'm dealing with another problem. So I couldn't catch all of what you said, but I think months ago I mentioned with Ms. Johnson that I agree. I didn't think the subjective process that we went through was as helpful as it could be to her, and gave us the opportunity to really talk about the goals and how we met them. So I like, it's just an initial comment, but I like looking at that together.
Great. Director Busick.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Much better. Thank you.
Okay. Lower my hand. So what I was saying is that once we establish the metrics for the objective analysis, the comp philosophy and goals and how they align with the strategic plan, I think those things kind of take care of themselves, how we measure those. I think the most important thing is the subjective side of things, and the fact that we really don't have a good way to get subjective comments to our general manager. I remember last year we had comments that we had to go back out to directors for clarification because, what does it mean? So, I think that's really important. How directors feel about what the general manager is doing, I believe would be important for the general manager to have a clear understanding. And if our tool to get the detail from us to her is not working well, which it apparently isn't, that's something I would really like to see a strong focus on. Thanks. Oh, wait, a couple more things. When you talk about compensation philosophy, are you referring to the Gallagher report's reference to competitive and highly competitive areas? Is that right? Yeah. Okay.
Yes, I am. And also, just to answer that question further, there's other things too. I think even just thinking about the role itself and what's needed for any given time. So, for example, how we might, taking Ms. Johnson out of the role for a moment and thinking about the role, how we would view compensating a turnaround CEO, for example, or a heavily operationally oriented CEO, for example. So it might be our compensation philosophy might be, we want to be leading the market, but given the needs of the agency, we want to lead the market all in. So we might heavily weight, and I'm just using this as an example, not actually suggesting we do this, but that the incentive compensation or bonus compensation over and above base might be a higher percentage of overall compensation if we were trying to lead the market and attract a CEO that's more motivated by meeting those goals and hitting those incentives. So what I mean there is, yes, using what the Gallagher report is fundamentally posing the question to us of where do we want to sit from a competitive standpoint, but also having, setting a policy of what this board's compensation philosophy is for its current CEO, which may need to change. That policy we could put in place of, are we leaders? Where are we? We might shift the exact wording of that policy every couple of years based on the type of CEO we need for that given time. So that's what I'm referring to. And I actually would go one step further to say we probably need a meeting just on that. And we may be able to benefit from some internal expertise. I don't want to volunteer anyone quite yet, but I have some thoughts about how we might be able to have a discussion internally to set that policy. So that's just to answer your question there, Director Busick.
Thanks for that.
Right. Thank you. And I see Ms. Pileggi has joined as well. Thank you very much. Other comments from directors? Yeah, Director Busick, please.
All right. So in terms of next steps and next meetings, if we're trying to clarify, rectify, fix the subjective component of the evaluation this year, we might want to start focusing on that sooner rather than later. It's just a thought. Thank you.
Yep, I think that's a great point. Other directors?
I agree
Yeah,
with,
Director Creighton, yeah.
I agree with that. And I'm sorry, what was it you were suggesting that we do in September? I mean, are we going to start the subjective discussion sooner?
I think, yeah, the subjective, so just again to recap, I think we have subjective criteria, we have objective criteria. Unless others disagree with my characterization of our last discussion, and again, I'm going to open a general manager here in a moment, but unless anyone disagrees with me, I think both have issues, but we can't fix objective in 2023 because we're already into the year. So the September to October to November timeframe is to start framing up how we might better measure objective performance for 2024. In terms of subjective performance, the organizational values, for example, there's no reason, I think to Director Busick's point, we should start that as soon as possible. So we start talking about what a better review process might look like. I know things that have been suggested by a number of people have been 360 reviews. I know Director Sloan, you had a great idea about structuring a really good executive session around this. I know a lot of ideas have been floated, but subjective we can tackle right away. The September, October, November timeframe I was suggesting is if we want to adjust anything about objective measurement in 24, we have to start pretty soon because it's going to come up quickly.
Thanks.
So not seeing other hands up, I want to open the floor to General Manager because I know we've said a lot. This is, about your role largely. I mean, there is the agency component, there's the General Manager component, but given that you own the performance of the agency, most of this, falls on your shoulders. So I'd love to hear your feedback, your thoughts about any number of these topics as it relates to the agreement, the strategic plan, the Gallagher report. And I had mentioned prior, they referenced our conversation about, how do you measure your team? So anything you'd like to comment on, please go ahead and take whatever time you'd like.
Yes, thank you so much, Director Davidson. I appreciate your framing of the issue that we have at hand and comments that have been made. I do think there is an opportunity as we look at 2023, recognizing that in the first year of my employment, we had 3 contract amendments. I don't want us to be limited. I really think it's incumbent upon you all as the board to provide me with vital feedback, separating myself from the equation as you outlined. It's whomever is sitting in this role. Basically, doing this role in absentia without any solid feedback makes it a challenging environment. So I would implore you to lean into the discussion and be more robust in having dialogue around it. I will not be offended. I am one that has been in this space and managed employees for decades. And in doing so, it's imperative that there's two-way dialogue because managing expectations are paramount on both sides of the fence. And so as we talk about looking at what might we do in 2023, time is going to elapse quickly, recognizing that this fiscal year for this agency coincides with the calendar year, which limits our ability to do a myriad of things. And so recognizing that there is subjective and objective criteria, we can have discussions around that, and I will make myself available to lean into that discussion. I think it's for the betterment of the organization holistically. More specifically, as we talk about what needs to happen going forward, I would implore you also to understand that on a quarterly basis, we can establish check-ins with many goals per quarter. Those things can be interwoven into the values of the organization, which better give you an understanding of the things of which I'm performing. While a lot of this is outwardly facing, there's a myriad of things that happen internal to the organization of which you all often don't know anything about that absorbs an inordinate amount of time because anybody that's managed people recognize that 70% of the job is about the management of people. So I would welcome an opportunity to have a further discussion, perhaps with you and the chair and the vice chair of the committee, so we can start talking about this sooner rather than later, because we have another meeting that's before us May 3rd, and that's just in 3 weeks. And I don't necessarily know what milestones we have in place to ensure that this comes to fruition, because before you know it, we will be at the midpoint of our performance review period, which would be in June. So that's what I have at this juncture. Thank you for the opportunity to opine.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Johnson, for all that. Time is tight if we want to make improvements, and I think we may need to, we have to ultimately decide what we're going to get done right away and what will take some time. You mentioned the May meeting. Again, just to recap, the draft I had put together of some things we need to decide upon here is the establishment of a compensation philosophy for the role of CEO, setting the compensation increase against that philosophy, because as it stands right now, that's undefined, and then establish the improved process for subjective evaluation in 2023, and then finally start framing up what we do for 2024, which I think, Director Busick, if I've adequately captured your comments, it's let's get that subjective, and objective may start to take care of itself. I think, duly noted on all of your comments, Ms. Johnson, and thanks for the willingness to have additional conversations offline. Ms. Johnson, please go ahead.
I just thought of one thing, Mr. Chair. Thank you for indulging me. Perhaps what may be advantageous, and I know you and I had spoke about this during a one-on-one conversation to formulate the discussion for said committee that we're participating in now. I would be amenable to putting forward some suggestions of which the board can react to, working in tandem with experiences that I've had assisting in this capacity in different roles. And Ms. Pelleggi, who serves as our Chief People Officer, may be able to lend support as well. So I offer that up for your consideration. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. I think we need to be open to a number of different suggestions. And I know just to, Ms. Geisinger, or I'm sorry, Director Geisinger, please go ahead.
I just had a couple quick questions. When are the objective surveys being done?
Ms. Johnson?
Yes, pursuant to the board acting on the scope of work that came before you last month, that is being solicited right now. We anticipate getting proposals back, and that would be leveraged in September. It's done in September intentionally due to the fact that people are returning to school. It's seasonal uptick in ridership. Something else that we may take in consideration as well as we talk about community feedback is a 360 in the sense of engaging with those entities with whom I interact. That could be, agencies such as DRCOG, different jurisdictions and things of the like. So that's what I wanted to provide to you all for consideration as we talk about this holistically. Thank you.
Great, thanks. And then Eric, you were talking about the meeting next month and you said setting a compensation philosophy and then setting a compensation increase based on that philosophy. What do you have in mind? I mean, a number or?
I think what I would suggest is actually that committee members spend some time just focusing on that piece of compensation philosophy and that part of the agreement. The terms I'm using are from the agreement. So there was the agreement with the CEO refers to the need to do a compensation analysis and then references a compensation increase. That compensation increase is then used in the math in Exhibit B. And Exhibit B has a formula for the 2023 adjusted base salary and incentive compensation eligible. That formula has a compensation increase plus a cost of living adjustment or COLA. And 25% of the compensation increase is to be based on objective criteria. 25% of the compensation increase is set to be based on subjective criteria. And 50% of the compensation increase goes into the incentive compensation, and that is on the weighted success outcomes and goals. So I think, or objective. So the term I'm using is from the agreement, and unless we're going to amend and change, we need to make sure we have the numbers for that formula. So that would be getting the philosophy, have the number, and then be able to set that unless we're going to adjust the agreement. And I'm just going to pause there to ask Ms. Snyder if my understanding and my characterization of that was accurate.
Yes, Chair Davidson, that's accurate. I think the idea or the understanding at the time that the parties added that language to the contract would be that you'd have a third party come in, that was Gallagher, give you, do external benchmarking, take a look at the role. And then the compensation philosophy that Director Davidson is talking about is, again, focused on the role itself and determining, does RTD, when you think about attracting and retaining a GM and CEO, where is the philosophy? Are you thinking you want to be at market? Or are you thinking you want to be leading the market, far leading the market, below market? And then coming up in theory with, your budget. And I'm just going to throw out the idea of having the compensation increase, I think, was thought of in terms of a potential percentage. So you might say, okay, over the next 5 years, this is where we want the compensation to be. And in year one, it might be, an eligibility for X percentage increase. And in year two, it might be eligibility for Y percent increase. It's not to say that you have to execute on your compensation philosophy in 1 year. And I will let Charlene Pelleggi weigh in. I'm a lawyer. She's the one that really can probably articulate this a little bit more clearly when you're talking about.
Thank you, Director Davidson and Ms. Snyder. That's why my hand was up, because I just wanted Charlene to frame this, because I know this is a new concept for a lot of you that have not been in this space, and it's a common terminology, and we as an agency are working on our compensation philosophy. So Ms. Pelleggi, please, if you could go ahead and help educate and inform the board relative to the actual meaning relative to a compensation philosophy, that would be helpful.
Sure. So I'm going to speak in general terms from just a pure compensation perspective, and not with specificity to the language in the CEO GM contract. In simplest terms, and I think we all probably get this on its basic level, the compensation philosophy is designed around what's the compensation that, how are you going to drive performance? So it actually starts with what does success look like for the agency? So when we're looking at the agency as a whole, and then determining your compensation as to how are you going to entice and or motivate people to get there within your agency. So it will include whether you're going to be market-based. If you're going to be market-based, are you going to be a market leader? Going to be a market lagger? Are you going to drive and entice people predominantly through your culture? And not necessarily with being a top payer? Or are you going to be a top payer? And yeah, we get it, we're going to have some turnover. So it's really figuring out, it truly starts with what does success look like for the agency? That's the first point. And then looking at market, looking at base pay, looking at variable pay, and then the other holistic intrinsic components of compensation. Your base pay is just an extrinsic piece. So it's that holistic view. And for us right now in the agency, we're actually looking at that. We've gone market-based and we want to be market competitive, but we need to determine what that looks like. What is market competitiveness, and is it midpoint, or are we going to lead? And if we're not going to lead in compensation, then what are the other components of total compensation that we are going to consider in order to attract, motivate, and ultimately inspire employees, not just the GM, but all employees to meet the goals of the agency. And the last thing that I would say, it's critically important, this work for the board in establishing the overarching compensation structure philosophy, because that then ties in. So it should be a cascading piece through. So i.e. you wouldn't want to have a leading compensation philosophy for your staff, but have a counter philosophy for your GM and CEO, and nor would you want the reverse, generally speaking. So happy to provide any background material or any other stuff that could be helpful. I'm happy to do that legwork to help where I can. I've already extended that to Director Davidson.
And thank you for commenting on that, Ms. Pelleggi. Very much appreciated, and thanks for the offer to assist with that. One quick follow-up question to what you were just going through. And do we have documentation internally on, you referenced making some adjustments to our philosophy as an agency and made reference to market and wanting to get to market competitive. Are there documents that at this point, and I recognize this may be premature given your reference to change, that could be shared with this committee?
To be shared, the only document that we would have right now would just be our general compensation handbook, which references we're going to be we have a market-based compensation philosophy. What I would direct you to that is helpful is, and I don't have it open in front of me, but from my recollection, the Gallagher report that was done did a competitive scan on the GM CEO compensation. That's actually really helpful. In particular, the pieces with respect to areas where the compensation was deemed to be, so thinking total compensation, not just base comp, where there were gaps. That actually is really, I don't have the page, I don't have it in front of me again, but that's really helpful, and that will direct, because it's not just your compensation philosophy, again, takes in all of the components of compensation. And so there was on that page, I recall, a very detailed summary that showed where RTD was competitive and where it was lagging. So that would be a very important reference point. For us internally, we're developing all of the internal communication pieces. Right now, it just says we're market-based, and we're still doing that work to determine where exactly in the market we wish to be.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. I appreciate it. Yeah, given that, we're going through that change right now, and as you mentioned, cascading would be important. I think it'd be great to align the efforts of this board with what we're doing in the agency. And thanks for being willing to help on that. And I'd be happy to reach out to you offline so we could continue the discussion about maybe even, framing a topic, a discussion item for a future committee meeting here in the near future. Thank you. Director Sloan, please.
Thank you. I would just like to recap what you have indicated is this committee's job and the timeline for doing it. And as I see it, we are talking about deciding working on the compensation philosophy at our next meeting. And of course, we can use all the expertise we can get, from staff and from the Gallagher report, and then perhaps taking it through the executive committee and board cycle for the end of May to propose a compensation philosophy at the board meeting. Am I correct about you're seeing that as our first job and the timeline for it?
I think setting that, yes, we need to do that as soon as possible. If that's lacking right now. So yes, I think there's a couple things we need to tackle, and definitely, I think that's a key one.
Okay, the initial one, because Ms. Pileggi has said everything flows from that, and this committee and then the full board needs to be aware of everything that goes into setting the compensation philosophy. So that I see is like our May job. June is to work on not only the subjective questions, but also the process for getting through the subjective component of the evaluation, because it might include a lot more than just responding to questions that are proposed. And that could go through June. The third component is the objective part of the evaluation, and we are, as you indicated, we are obligated by the contract to have that prepared by December. So even though that might have different issues to tackle. This committee really needs to do that if we want a change for 2024 in the objective part of the evaluation. So that should come, you mentioned September. I'm thinking maybe it should start in July because there won't be activity during our August pause. So, I'm throwing this out there for committee reaction on, when do we have 3 parts of our job? And that is the philosophy, subjective component, and then the objective component. Or am I missing something? And how do we fit that into our meeting timeline? So thanks everybody for listening to that. And I would appreciate to see if I'm getting our job correct, because I know we want to do our job and work particularly with the general manager, but as well as staff to get a good product. We were not content with the process last year. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Director Sloan, for characterizing that in a more structured way. What I heard you say is May, we would go through compensation philosophy, possibly June, be discussing subjective evaluation adjustments in terms of how we better get feedback to the general manager, and then starting the discussion in July around objective. The only thing I might suggest in reaction, curious to get your thoughts on this, Director Sloan, is maybe in May, we start the discussion around both subjective and around compensation philosophy, just given the timeline that we have right now to get through this. But did I capture your time frame suggestions, and what are your thoughts on the May meeting?
I think all is great. When Ms. Pelleggi was talking about a compensation philosophy, it seemed kind of complex. And it might be difficult to deal with both the subjective component and the philosophy in one meeting, but this group is able and willing, and we could go for it.
Okay, thanks for the comments. And I see Ms. Johnson, your hand came up, so perhaps you have a comment related to this.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Vice Chair Sloan, for your comments. My comment was directed to the subjective and objective. When I previously made comments, I said I was willing to put forward some elements for your consideration, and that could be a discussion item that you guys could take and digest and perhaps react to and have it formally agendized in whatever fashion as we go forward in June. But I think with the compressed schedule, I believe it's a missed opportunity, and I would be remiss not to state I have a deep feeling that we'll end up in the same place we were last year, with the calendar, elapsing or time elapsing very quickly. So that's what I wanted to offer up. In recognizing August, we take a pause. We're still working. We still have meetings. So if there needed to be a session in which to do this, I would make myself available. So just putting that out there, because I think it's critically important to the words that Ms. Pelleggi shared relative to a compensation philosophy. I know there's a lot of staff listening in on this conversation, because it is a hindrance when we talk about what it is that we're trying to do to be a competitive market leader. And then when we talk about compression with those in the leadership ranks, this is something that we have to be careful with. And I've made it known to members of my staff. I do not want it to appear as if I'm doing things that are self-serving to benefit me in my role as the general manager and CEO. So all of this is basically intertwined. So I wanted to share that so you guys garner a better understanding. And I think with Ms. Pelleggi's presentation or help with you all in May, this would provide some better understanding and context as to the critical components of this as we move forward, as we try to attract and retain talent from a full life cycle vantage point. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Ms. Johnson. Just a reaction to what you said there. I mean, the term that Ms. Pelleggi used was cascading, and quite frankly, I mean, and I agree that the timeline being compressed is a risk here. But this, where we're at here, this just shouldn't be this difficult, because things should be able to cascade. And this is where I'm, when we come to the objective piece, I think it's actually critically important that we tackle that, because if we agree on what agency success is that this board is measured on, because the board owns agency success, then we delegate what needs to be accomplished to the general manager. If she delivers on those things, but the agency doesn't succeed, that's the board's fault, right, for not giving the right criteria. Likewise, if General Manager Johnson then cascades down, these are the things that are necessary. I want to increase return on investment on fare box recovery. Just as a way of an example, if she's then delegated to her team and they all succeed in those areas, but those weren't the right things to move the ball, then clearly Ms. Johnson has failed, etc. The success and the failure should cascade. So I think where I'm struggling right now is we have a complicated agreement. I'm just going to say it. And we've amended this. We've got these formulas. It's clear that, there's just so many different concepts here. And at the risk of making a mess in a compressed timeline, we have to make this easier. Ms. Johnson should be able to take the criteria she's using to measure her team, take a subset of that, communicate to the board. We use a subset of that to measure her performance. Right now, it's clear from the way this happened last year, we're scrambling and so forth. It's just, it's messy. So I guess I'll just offer that. I recognize we've got a compressed timeline here, but I think we can at least make some improvements to start making this easier. Sorry, thanks for entertaining my comments there. Director Geisinger, please.
Thanks for that that summary, that analysis. I think that's helpful, and I also appreciate Director Sloan's comments. Charlene, I just had one question. You were talking about the compensation philosophy if you're a market leader or at market, and that that shouldn't be different from our CEO than from the rest of the staff. So does that mean that whatever we decide for the CEO would apply to the rest of the staff?
Great question. No, so for clarity, what when you're looking at the compensation philosophy, why I say it's connected and you shouldn't have two disparate views is because it takes into the type of organization, the size of the organization, the fiscal responsibility. So it's the whole picture of the organization, and then comparing that through to market and the complexity. So that general overarching compensation philosophy should be for the agency. Now, how it's applied, you could have a different executive, like so GM, CEO compensation structure that would be different from the leadership team and potentially different from the rest of the agency. But the philosophy behind it, so whether you're going to be leading or lagging, what I wanted to highlight there is you wouldn't want to, because it would be a demotivator for whichever group, you wouldn't want to have a compensation philosophy for the agency, excluding the GEM and CEO, that is, we're going to be at, I'll use compensation terms, but we're going to be at P75. So we're going to pay at, we're going to want to be at the top 75th percentile in the market, and then make your GM CEO by contrast at P40. So we're going to pay at 40%. The reason being is because you'll slowly have disparate actions, and then it'll impact the amount of effort and the quality of candidates you can attract. So it's, hopefully that clarifies. It should be the general philosophy based on the organization, its competitive set, where it draws its talent from, and that's why it could be different for your GM, CEO in certain perspectives. But whether you're going to be a market leader or a market lagger, that would and I'm being very generalized here, you would want that to be for the whole agency. Not, that would be your compensation philosophy and the construct of what you include for total compensation. So pensions, benefits, and any other additional benefit offerings, variable pay, you would want that to have consistency. But there can then also be variability depending on the position in the organization.
Right. That's helpful. I'm still a little confused. I mean, obviously we'll want to work together with you on this, but if you're working on that for the agency, if that's what I understood, and we're trying to set it, I guess I'm not clear. Do we make the decision for the agency?
So the agency right now is already based on the compensation philosophy for the agency today is based on market.
Okay.
So it is a market-based, and that's what internally has been shifted, and that's what would be reflective in the report that you got from Gallagher as they were going out and getting your market comparators. So it is a market-based compensation philosophy. What is maybe set and maybe not, is what components of the current compensation do we have that, or that we don't have, that we think we should have, and where should they be? So it sounds really complex. Once you break it down into, we're going to be market-based, which is what I believe we have today, unless the board chose we're not going to be market-based, that would be different. And then you're going to be where in the market. So do you want to lead the market? Do you want to be mid of the market? Do you want to lag the market? It's as simple as that. And then it's what are the total compensation components that we wish to add? And those should have consistency generally throughout the organization.
Great, thank you.
And I'll just mention that, as Ms. Pelleggi, you were referring to, around page 8 and 9 is where there's the market review practices, and there's some comparison as it relates to the general manager in terms of those percentiles. And just, if I may, have follow up to Director Geisinger's point while we're on this topic, Ms. Pelleggi, and I'll admit my blind spots here. I've spent my time in the private sector in CEO or board roles, but my understanding is the mix could be different. So if we say we want to be 75th percentile, a CEO, and certainly what I'm used to, would be, more weighted towards incentive compensation depending on the needs of the agency or the organization, and perhaps as thus with that additional risk, perhaps able to go above the percentile or under, but also be underneath. So let's say we said we wanted to be 75th percentile to increase, retention and attracting of employees. If we were to make a decision like that, it might be that the CEO can run anywhere from 55 to 85 because there's such a heavy weighting on incentive compensation that perhaps a different role wouldn't bear that risk. That another role in a lower risk, position might be 75. Is that an appropriate way? And I know we can discuss this at a compensation philosophy meeting, but is that a reasonable way to think about what might be possible for RTD as well?
Correct. That is spot on. That's why I said the general philosophy would be market-based, but then the constructs could be different. The weighting, what's included and what is not, would be different as well. And again, thank you for grabbing those for telling those pages. You'll notice things. Again, don't have it in front of me, but it's not uncommon for GMs and CEOs or senior executives to have access to some form of executive health plans. You would not offer that throughout the organization. So there will be different pieces. But yes, and again, that ties back to what does success look like and how does the agency wish to drive that success? And so that goes by the weighting. If you really want to keep people long-term, and you might want to have a higher base compensation and less variable pay. If you're really looking to make change and to push specific deliverables, you may change that mix where you have, as you said, 55 to 75, whatever market base pay, but you could really push the total compensation through variable pay, and that drives performance.
Thank you for the follow up on that, and thanks, Director Geisinger, for the clarification on that. Director Catlin, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Charlene, I really appreciate that you circled back to what does success look like, and I kind of wanted to punctuate that point, because we can have an overarching philosophy, but at the end of the day, we need to really take a look at what drives the success for the agency. It seems to me, Chair Davidson, that May's meeting is going to be pretty involved. And if we're talking about the compensation philosophy and then maybe even looking at some of the subjective items, I would suggest that we might reserve ample time for that discussion, which I think could take a while. That's all I have. Thanks.
Duly noted. Thank you. I think that makes sense. I think starting to get some ideas I could propose at the end here of meeting topics. Director Busick, please.
Thanks, and I'll try to be brief. I guess I have some concern about the board setting a compensation philosophy for the entire agency and not just the GM CEO. I believe that our responsibility is to hire, retain, evaluate the GM CEO, whatever she decides the compensation philosophy is for the rest of her staff really should be her decision. Ultimately, that can impact her performance. But when we cross that line and start telling the GM CEO, here's where your employees need to be. Here's what we think you need to do regarding your staff. Now I think we're blurring the lines of our rights, roles, and responsibilities. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Director Busick. Appreciate it. I'm wondering if Ms. Pileggi, if you have any comments on that.
Yeah, Director Busick, that's thank you again for that clarity. The board in this essence would be setting the compensation philosophy for the GM CEO. The agency then, under the director of the GM CEO, we would then model the compensation philosophy off of that. Meaning, again, just to make sure that there's a alignment, because we wouldn't want to be offering something that was significantly counter to the general premise or direction that the board was looking for compensation. And again, I'll keep it just in the simplest, lagging, midpoint, or leading. If the board had set lagging because we had fiscal restraints and we needed to be very conservative in our overall compensation, that would be potentially difficult then for the agency to follow suit with a leading compensation philosophy, because then it would be, well, we have one employee that we're going to have as lagging because we need to be fiscally prudent, but we're going to take the other 3,000 and we're going to pay them leading market. That's what I mean. So it is clear you would set it only for the GM CEO, and then it would serve as a benchmark that we would use after that.
Okay, I get that, but I want it to be very clear. That's not our job. And if the GM CEO says everybody else is a minimum wage employee, that's on the GM CEO. And I understand it should act as a benchmark, but doesn't necessarily have to. And I hope it does, but I just want to make a clear distinction of our role. But thanks for that.
Understood. And if I could just say, this is the HR person looking to have consistency through an organization. So that's where my brain goes, but understood. Your point is well made and you are correct.
Thank you, Director Busick and Ms. Pileggi. Ms. Johnson, please.
Yes, thank you so much. And thank you, Director Busick, for your comments. And that is most certainly true in reference to my day-to-day responsibility as it relates to employees overarchingly. And that is why we embarked upon looking at a compensation philosophy. So I just wanted to acknowledge your comments and say I support that. The board should not be setting that. The framework in which Ms. Pileggi has outlined and which she and I have talked about is ensuring that we are competitive, recognizing where we are in the transportation market, with us only being the only intermodal transit agency in the entire state. It's incumbent upon us to have a very clear compensation philosophy. So I just wanted to acknowledge those comments and rest assured that we're in alignment with your thoughts. Thank you.
Great. I just didn't want any unintended consequence where we're tying your hands inadvertently. I want that to happen. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Director Busick, for the clarification, and Ms. Johnson, Ms. Pileggi. I mean, one thing that this would give us, though, if we had the philosophy here, is it gives us the vocabulary to be able to ask Ms. Johnson, what is the agency compensation philosophy, or if there's a particular area where we're having problems with retention, something we could look at. So I do think that, yeah, a great comment, Director Busick, not something we'd set. It'd be, if this board were to decide that a policy priority or an annual goal had anything to do with retention, it would give us the right vocabulary to be able to say, well, what's the compensation philosophy in a given position, much the same way we're concerned with whether or not we retain our CEO. Thank you. Not seeing other hands currently up, I'm going to make a pitch proposal here, and thank you for going over. I think we need to set the next one for an hour and a half. But a proposal would be to get together in May, hear everybody loud and clear that we have a big topic here to talk about compensation, philosophy, look back at Gallagher, really get into the details of that. We could do that in May. June, I believe Ms. Johnson suggested that she might be able to come forward with some ideas about holistic and overall assessment. June could perhaps be a discussion around subjective assessment, as well as hearing ideas from the general manager. And then I do think from what I'm hearing in here, we would like to have a July meeting. I think this performance committee needs to meet while we get this ironed out. So if that were to sound good, I'm going to just ask a question to Ms. Pelleggi, whether you'd be, I know there's a lot going on at the agency right now, particularly as it relates to personnel, but looking at that May 3rd meeting, would you be willing, comfortable, is it enough time to be able to come to this group and present at the discussion item around compensation philosophy, give some additional background? We could have some discussion and start making some decisions. Is that something you'd be comfortable with?
Yes.
Thank you. So that would be May. That would be hearing from Ms. Pelleggi on a presentation, this group dialoguing with the background that this group really picks through that Gallagher report. And then in June, we could get back together, talk about the subjective performance, have a better dialogue about what worked and didn't work, and hear some suggestions from Ms. Johnson. Again, Ms. Johnson, cognizant that there's a lot going on in the agency. Did I hear you correctly that you are offering that, and does that give you sufficient time to come forward with some ideas to propose to this group in June?
Yes, that's ample time. I've been working on it already. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And then I'll suggest that at the May meeting, we have a discussion, since we're over the time that was allotted here, about future meetings and setting July and whether we would work in August. Director Busick, please.
No, I hate to say this, but we can meet more than once in a month. It's only an hour.
We can. Thank you for pointing that out. I'm trying to see what we can get done here to avoid a high concentration of meetings, but it may very much be needed. Yeah, Ms. Johnson, please go ahead.
Yes, just keeping in mind that another agenda item that will come forward in June, it goes back to the question in which Chair Geisinger had asked relative to the community and customer surveys, recognizing how this is structured. You all would have to look at staff's recommendation as related to leveraging a contract and delegating authority to me in which to do so. And we foresee that coming forward to this body in June. So I just wanted to ensure that that was on your radar, recognizing we're setting agendas and trying to discuss time in more than one meeting. So just wanted to put that out there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Appreciate it. I'm just going to ask real quick here if I can get a thumbs down or any no votes on making the next meeting, actually all future meetings of the Performance Committee for the time being, an hour and a half. Does that conflict for anybody? Maybe looking most at May 3rd. Yeah, Director Geisinger, please.
Just, not to make it about me, but I probably won't be here May 3rd. I'm going to try, but I probably won't be able to attend.
Okay. Director Busick?
I'll be out of town. I'm in up the coast of Scotland, so I don't think I'll be able to.
Okay, I missed some of that audio, but you're going to be out of town, you said, Director Busick?
Right.
All right. I will take this offline to work with board staff to see if we can, what we can do here to make sure that I know we don't want to be changing meeting times, but I think it's pretty important to get this committee together, and disappointed we don't have everybody today. It's an important topic for the board. So I will work with board staff and my colleagues here to try to find a way to get a time that we can all be together. So thank you. As it stands right now, the next meeting of this committee would be May 3rd. Ms. Snyder, please.
Yes, thank you, Director Davidson. So just one other thing for you all to keep in the back of your mind. We have the bylaws do, of course, say that this committee is not only going to focus on the GM and CEO's performance, but also monitoring the metrics of the agency's strategic plan performance. So that might be something to think about when you think about the cadence of your meetings and when this committee wants to hear from staff about those updates.
Right. Yeah. Thank you for pointing that out, Ms. Snyder. I think absolutely something that, going through the strategic plan, we need to get a little bit more clarity on how we're measuring agency performance. Ms. Johnson, please, and then we'll call on Director Catlin. Ms. Johnson.
Yes, thank you so much, General Counsel Snyder, for broaching that. I did have a conversation with Chair Davidson some time ago as it relates to that, and just for everybody's edification, we as a leadership team and including the management team are having an offsite as we talk about strategic plans and scorecards. So in reference to managing everyone's expectations, there's a couple of elements in which we're changing, recognizing that the strategic plan is evergreen and things change over the course of the year. So most definitely that would be forthcoming. And I appreciate the reminder that General Counsel had put forward, was going to broach that at the May meeting as we go forward, because I'd have a better understanding of where we are after we have our strategic planning session with the management team collectively. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Ms. Johnson, Ms. Snyder. Yeah, I would think, again, this should be easy. This shouldn't be complicated. So if there's performance, criteria that you're using to measure your team, and that gets a little bit more solidified, those are things that from an agency perspective, just as you do to frame your updates to us every meeting at the board meeting around those success outcomes, we can hear updates on how we're doing as an agency. Director Catlin, please.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. And I just wanted to say that I appreciate you being willing to work with board staff to schedule this. It looks like we have potentially 2 directors who will not be able to attend in May. And I think this is going to be a really critical meeting. And since we have a few committee members who were not able to attend today, there might be a need to catch them up prior to the next meeting. So I just think that this is an important meeting and we probably need to take a careful look at rescheduling so that we have optimal attendance. And I do support an hour and a half going forward. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, if I may be so forward, I know my schedule is tough. I know many of our directors' schedules are tough, but I think we need to insist on our committee members being together for this discussion. Ms. Johnson, please.
Yes, thank you. And I appreciate Director Catlin's comments relative to scheduling, recognizing that it would be advantageous to look at regular meeting cadence, because quite naturally as well, I, as the general manager and CEO, and Ms. Pileggi and Ms. Snyder have recurring meetings as well. So we'll have to adjust our schedules, recognizing that during the course of the day, there's typical meetings that are already been scheduled. And while this is very important, want to balance out our commitments with external entities and things of the like as we try to go about the day-to-day operation of the agency. So I just felt that I needed to say that as well, recognizing that people may have vacations and things of the like. We want to work in earnest and accommodate meetings to the best of our ability. So while we work with board staff and they're on so they can hear this as well, it's imperative that I am in attendance, Ms. Pileggi and Ms. Snyder, I would say chiefly as well. Because oftentimes I think I just don't want that to be missed. That you guys are here and we're not. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Johnson, for that comment. Absolutely. I think the committee being together and key members of staff being together and making sure we pick times that work for everybody and are realistic is important. So thanks for noting that. And if we can get something that's predictable on the schedule, that would be great. Okay. Thank you for going over, everybody, on the hour that we had scheduled here. I think, is there any other discussion we want to bring up, or are we okay with the next meeting being focused? Let's get this way. As long as we're okay with the next meeting being focused on compensation philosophy, I think we have our immediate next step. I'll work with board staff to get something scheduled that works for staff and board. Any other points on this topic, this discussion item here today? All right, great. Any other matters to come before this committee? I just want to take the moment to say thank you to everybody. I know that I threw a lot out there. I know we're mixing things up a little bit, but when I hear that there's a dissatisfaction of the board and staff on measuring performance, I hear that that's probably one of the most important and fundamental things this board does. So we gotta fix it. We gotta make it work. So thank you for the patience today and for being willing to make a little bit of a mess here. So the next meeting date is May 3rd, 2023 at 9 a.m. Mountain Daylight Time. Again, that may change. Please stay tuned. Seeing no other discussions, this meeting will be adjourned at 10:18 Mountain Daylight Time. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a good